I would say I'm only maybe 20% recovered. I'm still a really bad fixer. I mean, I'm a good fixer. I think my ideas are amazing.
Traditional male characteristics are things like aggression or decisiveness. Traditional female characteristics are things like patience, empathy. We don't actually need more female leaders. What we need is more leaders who act like females. And women just happen to be better at that. Which is why I'm excited to talk to DeDe Halfhill. She is a powerhouse and a badass. She was in the Air Force for over 25 years, and she advised some of the most senior leaders in the military, from the chiefs of staff to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. She was a leader in a profession dominated by men and machismo. As she was learning to be a leader, she could have followed their model, but she didn't. She forged her own, one built on clarity, vulnerability, and a deep understanding of what truly inspires people to follow. This is actually not about men versus women. This is about finding the right traits that make any of us, all of us, better leaders. This is a bit of optimism. You and I have known each other a very long time.
A long time.
Too long.
No,
Some
not
would
too
argue.
long.
In fact, I met you probably 3 years before Start With Why was a TED Talk or a book or anything like that.
Yeah.
In fact, I think you are more responsible for my relationship with the military than almost anybody else. It's true. You were forced to be in a meeting that I was there.
Yes. Well, I wasn't forced. I was excited to be there. I wasn't excited to see you. I was excited to have the conversation because I'd spent years trying to get to these leaders, and you were there to help pave the inroads for that.
That's true. Okay. You and I have had this conversation many times about what is female leadership. 25 years in the Air Force, and you left just recently. You grew up in a very male-dominated machismo world, and I'm very curious if there is such thing as female leadership.
I would say yes and no. You know, I think I shared a story with you about just prior to going to Iraq. And I was going to be taking command for the very first time. This was my second tour to Iraq. So I wasn't necessarily nervous about going to Iraq, but I had some apprehension about going into command. What I didn't know, I didn't grow up in the world of the squadron I was going to be commanding. And so I had reached out to a female leader I very much respected and admired. She's amazing. And I said, listen, I'm getting ready to go take command. What do I need to know as a woman? And she said, nothing. Leadership is leadership. And I thought, oh, okay, great. So I went over to Iraq and I was in command, and I was constantly butting up against things that just didn't feel right. Like I felt like something was off. Like I had one captain at one point, we were having struggles with our dining facility. And I said, like, hey, we really got to get this in check. Backstory, it was all about Cocoa Puffs. I had a commander who was anti-Cocoa Puffs, but we don't have time to go into that today. And he said, all over it, ma'am. I got this. And I was like, oh, okay. I didn't think much of it. And then a couple weeks later, the Cocoa Puffs were still there. And I asked him again, like, hey, what's going on with the Cocoa Puffs? And he's like, ma'am, I told you we're all over it. We got this. And I said, well, I don't think you do, because Cocoa Puffs are still there. Little moments like that where it just felt like I was being dismissed, where it felt like I was getting these pats on the head, even though I was substantially senior to him in rank. And I thought, oh, that's just feels off. I then had another moment where a leader senior to me was giving me feedback. And he said, listen, I think you're doing a great job, but sometimes I think you flirt to get your way. And I was like, flirt? Like, it just threw me into a tailspin, because you know me. I mean, I don't ever try to use femininity to get my way or to make inroads. I did grow up in the Air Force as a communications officer, public affairs officer is what we call it in the military. I was the liaison to the community, to the media, sometimes to Congress, which means I had to be personable and I had to know how to engage people.
Very different from flirting.
Very different from flirting. And it threw me into such a tailspin, because sometimes I share this story and I'll ask people, what does flirting look like to you? So if I were to ask you right now, like, what does flirting look like to you? How would you know if someone's flirting with you?
I think flirting, like when you're in a social place with someone, and you're both trying to send signals to each other, like, "Hey, I kind of like you," and you look to get those signals back. And we're social animals; we're attuned to it. Some better than others, but it's the dance of mating.
Yeah, but what are the behaviors you're seeing?
What are the behaviors you're seeing? Well, but I think context also matters. Like if I make a joke in a social context, it could be a flirt. If I make a joke in a professional context, just, like I make a little self-deprecating joke.
Yeah.
Extreme flirting would be, I guess, touching. Somebody rubbing a knee or touching a shoulder. That's a flirt.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the proverbial batting your eyelids.
Which I can't do.
Which I can't do either.
But
I don't know. It's hard.
It is, right? You make my point.
It's a good question. It's hard.
You make my point in that most of us can't describe it. And when we do, we say things like, well, you were smiling. You might have giggled. I actually touched one of your staff members this morning when I came in and I said, "How are you doing?" I touched his shoulders, right? And so these behaviors
Stop flirting with my staff.
I know, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And so all of these behaviors that sometimes people say are flirtatious behaviors are the very same behaviors that I had to cultivate as a public affairs officer. Smiling, being
Okay, so is there such thing as female leadership or not?
Yeah, so I was getting there. So I left there thinking, oh my gosh, there was so much about that experience that was different because I was a woman. And so, yes, do I think sometimes there are things about being a woman in a male-dominated environment that may just be behaviors that come naturally to us? Things like more communicative, right? We tend to collaborate. We tend to communicate more. We tend to be more inclusive in bringing people in, not exclusive to women, but maybe more practiced by women. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, I think there are ways that men traditionally behave. There are ways that women traditionally behave. I don't think it's male leadership and female leadership. I think it is, there are some behaviors that maybe as a general rule, not in its entirety, that we might be more practiced at. I think there's a bigger discussion to have. Like you would ask me what it was like being a woman in the military or is there female leadership? When I get asked the question, what was the hardest part about being a woman in the military? The answer I've come to is the emotional labor. Because I had these skills and I could sit in that discomfort of other people's emotion, people started to come to me. And I would have people come to me from other squadrons who would say, "Hey, ma'am, could I get 10 minutes of your time?" And I'd be like, of course, right? Because I want everyone to feel healthy and to get through, like to talk about the things that are frustrating them. And what I realized after like a year or so of doing this was that that's real time. So spending all that time when people would want to talk to me about where they were struggling, the time I spent doing that, because I believe in it and I think it matters, is time I wasn't getting to go out and talk to my units. It was time I wasn't getting to do the admin that all of us have to do, wasn't getting through emails. And so it was it was a quantifiable thing. And so the hardest part for me about being a woman in the military was not all of the environmental things that people think about being a woman in the military. It was to be the kind of leader I wanted to be. Is it because I'm a woman or not? I don't know. But my ability to sit in that emotional space was time that my male peers did not have to expend, right? Because their own people weren't going to them to talk because they didn't have the ability to sit in this space with them, which means they didn't have that half hour, or they had that half hour to do other things. They had that hour to do other things. That for me, when I look back, is probably the hardest. That was the hardest thing.
You told me, which is, but people respond differently to men versus women. You told me about there was an army, I think it was an NCO who was in your command back in Iraq, and he said to you, "Ma'am, when a male leader yells at me, all good, water off my back, totally got it, up to whatever he needs me to do. When you yell at me, I feel like my mom's yelling at me. And it's a different response. And so I think when men engage with men and men engage, like, I think there is a dynamic of traditional mom-dad dynamics. I mean, is that true? Or is that just unique to him, that if you yell at him, it comes across very differently than if a male leader yells at him, how he responds?
Yeah, I mean, same situation, same time in Iraq. There were 3 female commanders. 2 of the 3 of us were investigated for mistreatment of our airmen. A friend of mine was the investigating officer, and he said, I'm not seeing these women do anything I don't see men do every day. But when the women do it, it is perceived to be more toxic than when the men do it. The research shows that when men behave differently than society thinks we should be behaving, we are held to a different standard, and it's used against us more.
So what was the behavior? What was the thing that they were upset about that men do all the time?
I mean, swearing.
Swearing
Was the big one.
Swearing in the military.
She cussed at me. She dropped the F-bomb too many times.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That was the toxic behavior.
That was it. It was the behaviors of get it done, get your proverbial shit together. And when women behaved in a way that we all see men do every day. In fact, in most cases, men are rewarded for it. They're decisive.
So interesting.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. And I think you're right. It's these societal expectations. It's not the behavior per se. It's the expectation in the lane. If we think about what the lanes are in the 1800s and the but I'm serious. like if we go back through time, what the lanes for acceptable behavior for men and women have been, you know, those lanes move. Culture advances and norms and standards of behaviors change, and those lanes of expectations change. And that's very interesting that when somebody steps out of that lane of expectation, we find that jarring.
Yeah.
In your case, worthy of investigation.
Yeah. It's so interesting because what used to be held against women, I think, is actually being held against men just as equally now.
Yeah.
You know, I was in Iraq, that was 2010, so that's 15 years ago. And the way I'm watching leadership change now, the feedback I get from employees who are working for leaders who maybe grew up in a very command and control environment, they are no longer tolerating that. Even in a traditionally command and control environment of the military, it's no longer being tolerated.
So now there's a new expectation, and too many, in this case men is what we're talking about, have been practicing in a different lane, and now they're trying to conform to the new lane.
100%. And they feel really lost because they've seen one kind of leadership modeled.
Yeah.
The expectations are changing rapidly.
Yeah.
They have not seen modeled the kind of leadership we actually need today.
Yeah. Okay, let's go deep.
Yeah, okay.
We've been playing up here.
Okay. Uh-oh.
When you were deployed, so 3 things happened to you simultaneously. Any one of those would have been difficult to manage by themselves. You were promoted. You were given your first command. And you were deployed for 365 days. So any one of those things is difficult to manage by itself, and all 3 of those happened simultaneously to you.
And command of a squadron I had no experience in.
And command of a squadron you knew nothing about, right? That wasn't your training.
Right.
Okay, so we'll add 4 things in there.
I could add a 5th, but we won't.
What was the 5th?
I was the only female in my leadership group.
Okay, so any one of those 5 things is difficult to manage, and you had all 5 things happen simultaneously. And off you went for your deployment, and I saw you maybe a week after you got back, 2 weeks at the most. But it was all the emotions were raw, the experience was raw, and we went out for dinner, and I asked you a very simple question, which is, how was it?
It's so funny because even putting myself right back in that moment, hearing you say it, like I can feel all the raw emotions.
Tell me, as best you can remember, you took command of a squadron that was underperforming, and if I recall, the previous leaders had all been fired. Like the previous 2 or 3 leaders had been fired, and you were like, I'm going to turn it around. I'm going to be the one. I'm going to be the one who fixes this and makes. If I recall,
the career field as a whole was really having trouble with its commanders.
You were responsible for all the base operations at Balad Air Base.
Yeah, feeding, fitness, and fun.
Okay.
Right. So, and housing, and I mean, just everything that allowed people to exist on the base. The story I told you was that it just felt like everything was going wrong. I had a day where I went back to my trailer, and the inner story I was telling myself is, you are the absolute worst thing that has ever happened to leadership. You are a complete failure. Who thought that you could do this? Like, I had all of the shame narratives running on repeat and at max volume. And I had this moment where, I first had my little mini breakdown, but then I had this moment after talking to a couple friends about it that I thought, if I have failed, and maybe I have, maybe I'm not meant to be a commander. Maybe this just isn't my calling. I'll go back to public affairs, which is all about, again, engagement, communication. I'll just go back to that, and I'll have a great career in the Air Force. So if I have failed, what impact do I really want to have? What do I want these people who I have been entrusted to care for, what do I want them to know? I want them to know they matter. I want them to know that what they're doing here is not in vain. I want them to know that the time away from their family, the time away from their lives, the danger they are accepting is worth something. And it matters because so often the airmen in my squadron, so often they were the ones who took the brunt of everyone else's stress. I would have a pilot throw milk at one of my airmen at the dining facility because we changed the policy on takeout, right? We couldn't take out containers anymore. I would have my airmen get yelled at because their laundry wasn't done in a timely fashion, even though it wasn't my airman doing the laundry, it was a contractor. And so they were just always taking the brunt of people's bad behavior. And so they were always getting beat up. And you could see that in their energy. Often it just felt like we were beat dogs. And I thought, I want them to know, that's not true. That story they're telling themselves isn't true. I want them to know they matter. And I didn't know it then, but it started the journey of the next 15 years of my career, because I realized I may never be the best at anything. There are always going to be moments I'm going to feel like I'm failing. And who I want to be as a leader at the core is to make people know they matter and what they're doing matters. I think the first thing that happened was I felt better. And when I felt better, I wasn't barking as much. I wasn't as stressed. I wasn't as tied to outcomes because I was more concerned about the people. And you could just see a tangible shift in the way they laughed with one another, the way they came to me with opportunities and new ideas. I could see the way my own officers took a breath. And I think just overall, the stress level of the entire organization dropped.
But what ended up actually happening at the performance level?
You can't help but have better performance when you have all that.
Yeah. I remember when you told me the story, and it's nice to hear it, these 15 years later, because you're telling it differently. You're telling it with new perspective. But when I remember you telling me, which is, you came in, I was going to turn this place around. I was going to be this leader. I'm going to prove everybody they chose the right person. Mm-hmm. I'm young. I'm hungry. I got the skills. I'm going to do this. Rah, 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 right? And it wasn't working. Nothing was working. And you told me that for 6 months you cried yourself to sleep. That you regretted being in the Air Force, you regretted serving your country, you regretted being in Iraq, you were homesick, you wanted it all to end. And this is what you're saying, which is at some point you just accepted that you were a failure. And it was at the point of accepting failure that you said, well, screw it. If I failed anyway, I might as well make it that these people, for the time that they're away with their families, they have a decent time and prove to them that they matter. Mm-hmm. And things started to change. And you did turn it around. It did become a highly, highly successful command. And you went from fighting with those in your command to them, they would willingly follow you anywhere. And I remember, as you were telling me the story sitting at dinner, I remember exactly where we were too.
Oh, across from the Pentagon?
Yeah, it's Pentagon City.
Yeah.
There's a little restaurant in that square. It's dark. It's like a pub.
Oh.
And we sat in a corner in a very dark pubby kind of space, and we sat there pretty private so we could talk.
Champs, it's gone out of business.
Okay,
yeah.
well, that's right, it was Champs.
Yeah.
My God, look at us, 15 years later. And you sat there and you're telling me this whole story, the emotions right on the surface, and you started to cry. Mm-hmm. And you said, I've never felt pride like this, helping people realize they matter. Mm-hmm. A subject that I know you talk about. I genuinely want to know how you've learned to manage the feeling of loneliness as a leader, or in general. Like when I say loneliness, what washes over you?
Oh, gosh. I mean, that I'm not alone in the feeling of loneliness, right? Like it's everywhere. I think I'll tell you what made me feel the most lonely is feeling like I had no support around me. I think I felt loneliness, but I don't know that I really had the courage to address it until much later in my career. And it was a moment that I was out with one of my squadrons. This story is actually in the book Dare to Lead. Dr. Brene Brown included this story in the book. And I was out having a conversation with a group of my airmen, presenting an award. And at the end of the award, I said, like, what's on your mind? Which is a question I asked regularly. And one of my airmen raised his hand and he said, hey, ma'am, when's the ops tempo going to slow down? Because, like, man, we're super tired.
Operations tempo.
Yeah, ops tempo, sorry. Operations tempo. And I said, yeah, I hear you. Like, we're asking a lot of you. And so I asked the group, I said, how many of you are tired? You know, 3/4 of the whole room raised their hand. And I said, we ask a lot of you. We've been at war for 20 years. When we're not at war, we're at home preparing for an inspection. When we're not preparing for an inspection, we're training for an exercise. Like, there is just always something to be doing. So I get it. Oddly enough, 3 days prior to that conversation, I had read an article in Harvard Business Review. And it was talking about this organization that went into 5 different companies that were all reporting high levels of exhaustion. And it wanted to understand what was happening in those organizations that was causing that. And so it spent months talking to their leaders, talking to their employees, looking at their policies. And it came back after 2 months and said, it's not that people are tired, but people are lonely. And it's the feeling of loneliness that was manifesting itself as this feeling of exhaustion, that's the language we knew to use. Because the truth is, we didn't talk about loneliness at work, but we could talk about being tired. That's almost a badge of honor. Like, oh, I'm just so tired, I'm working so hard. But whenever in my career did I have someone without prompting say, I'm feeling really disconnected and lonely, feeling like I don't really fit here. And so I asked my group that day, if I were to ask you instead of who's tired, who's lonely, how many of you would raise your hands? And I asked it completely rhetorically, because again, not equipped really to have this conversation. And 3/4 of the room raised their hands. And I stood there for a moment, one, kind of paralyzed, like, oh shit, what do I do with this? But 2, heartbroken, because you know this, having spent so much time with DoD, we have an epidemic of rising suicide rates. And I knew that because I'd spent my whole career working with senior leaders every year when the suicide data report was released, trying to once again find just the perfect messaging to reach our airmen, to share with them the tools that were available, the support that was available. And year after year after year, the numbers were increasing and we weren't getting through. And here I am standing in front of a group of, let's be honest, mostly men. And they are sharing something with me that is a very real emotion, one we don't talk about. And I realize that we're not having conversations at the root level. And because we're not having those conversations at the root level, we are wasting so much energy just dealing with the symptoms. Because a word like lonely was so uncomfortable for us that we didn't know how to talk about it. I went to Wing Stand Up, which is our weekly meeting at the wing level. And I went to that meeting that week and I said, we need to be talking about loneliness. You know, luckily I'm at the table now. I'm not in the cheap seats against the wall. And to watch, I mean, you would not have seen discomfort more than we saw in that room that day. Like, they were like, oh my gosh, why is she talking about loneliness? Like, why are we having this conversation? And that was the moment when I watched all of my fellow peers and other commanders, when I saw their discomfort, I realized we're never going to get to the root of this problem if we can't get over the discomfort of language. And that was the moment when I realized I have to use the word lonely if we're ever going to be able to show people it's okay to talk about it, right? Like I had to, as a leader, go first in sharing that. So I think that's when I realized this isn't just a word that we should talk about in the dark corners where no one can really hear us. Like this is the kind of language we need to be bringing out into the light on a regular basis.
I find this insight not only particularly interesting, but very important, which is because we can publicly talk about being exhausted. And when people are lonely, it may show as exhaustion, may feel like exhaustion. And so it's the easiest thing to say, especially because we don't want to come to work and say, I'm feeling lonely. And the problem is even if you have a well-intentioned leader who sees that you're exhausted, sees something's wrong, they check in and you report, I am exhausted. They say, you know what? Take a day off.
Yes.
You've been burning the candle at both ends. Why don't you take a day off? Which means go be by yourself more.
Yeah.
Right? So even well-intentioned solutions to the problems that we perceive might, which is why we don't see the numbers change, which is why we see the loneliness epidemic rise and in the military and other places, the suicide rates rising. There's this intense loneliness and nobody knows how to talk about it for fear that it sounds weak or mushy, or just fear that I'm ill-equipped. Even the ones who want to talk about it, what if they say yes? I don't know what do I just, there? Like, what do I say?
Yeah.
So I think it's a very important conversation to say that these things exist. A friend of mine who you and I both know, who's active duty still, when they started offering therapists on base to talk to folks, and all the commanders went, hey, we got a therapist on base now. If you're feeling like you need to talk to somebody, I encourage you to go. But that commander never went. And so my friend was very vocal. He's like, look, if you got a busted leg, go see the leg doctor. If you're having thoughts, you go see the head doctor. It's totally normal. And he would say very publicly, hey, I got a lot of stuff going on, feeling super stressed out. I'm not going to be available from 3 to 4 on Thursday because I'm going to go see the therapist. Let me know if you need anything before or after that. He was very public that he was struggling and he was going to go talk to somebody.
Yeah.
And it normalized it, to your point.
I get brought into organizations that are very male-dominated, construction, law enforcement. I spend a lot of time with finance, which isn't always male-dominated.
Yeah, it's pretty broy.
Still, yeah.
Let's be honest, it's pretty broy.
And 2 of those 3 are because they too are really struggling with suicide rates and mental health crisis.
Yeah.
And they bring me in because of, I think, my ability to talk about these hard things without being too soft, because I come from such a hard background. Right. And if I'm being really honest, like I would have told you up until probably 2015, emotions have no place here. We've got real shit to do.
I've known you that long.
Yeah. We don't need to be talking about feelings.
I've known tough DeDe.
And what I realized is not talking about feelings was causing all the problems that were getting in the way of us doing good work.
Yeah.
That you can avoid it for only so long. It's going to come back to haunt you.
Yeah.
The problem in the military is that we rotate so much that we don't always see the long-term consequences of that until we have a suicide epidemic.
Yeah.
That is the long-term consequences. It's an uphill battle, I get that, but...
By the way, just as an aside, I hate the term mental health because it sounds like a goal to achieve. You either have it or you don't. Like you either have, I'm struggling with mental health issues and I'm going to do the thing so that I can achieve mental health, which is all you're going to do is lose.
What would you rather call it?
Mental fitness.
Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Because it's an ongoing process. It's like physical fitness is something I always have to do.
Right.
Sometimes ahead, sometimes I'm behind. But even if I'm in good shape, I have to keep doing it. And so I like mental fitness, which is like my body. I constantly work on my mind. And sometimes I'm super in shape and sometimes I'm not. And sometimes it's my fault. And sometimes it's because of lack of sleep and just like my body.
Yeah.
And so it's just something you work on. And it takes the stigma of achievement out of it.
From a mental fitness perspective, I'm a quick learner, Simon. The work that helped me the most is understanding shame resilience. anytime we have those feelings or thoughts of I'm not good enough, or if I do this, who do they think I am? I learned this idea of shame resilience, which is all about how do I talk to myself, really recognize the stories I'm telling myself, getting outside of myself to normalize them, which is a reality check. And if I don't have the conversation to normalize and get the reality check, which is often like, can we talk to someone and be met with empathy to get a reality check on all the lies I'm telling myself? Because I can tell myself a lot of them, some good, some bad. But knowing the work of shame resilience, identifying it, naming it, reality checking it, and then rewriting the story, right? Those are the steps of shame resilience. That is the regular weightlifting of my mental fitness, because I am prone to shame. I had a lot of experiences in my past that have made me prone to shame, to thinking I'm not good enough, to thinking I shouldn't do that because then they'll think I'm too big for my britches, right? And so I can very quickly go right to shame. Oh my God, that was horrible. You suck. What do you think you're doing? Did you see the way that guy in the front row was giving you the eye? Oddly enough, and you know this, the guy in the front row giving you the eye is usually the one who's thinking deeply about what it is you're saying, but that's not the story you hear in your head. And because I now have those tools and I have practiced them so much, they have now become close to second nature.
What are the tools?
Naming it, reality checking it, rewriting the story.
Right. And let's talk about the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is blaming the action. Shame is blaming yourself.
Yeah.
And guilt is not necessarily a bad thing. It's like, I told a lie. I need to talk to you. I feel really bad that I told you a lie.
Yes.
Guilt can sometimes produce good behavior.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Shame is, I'm a liar. I'm a horrible, horrible human being.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a question. Let me game this out with you. If somebody is struggling with shame, I'm a horrible person. And when you talk about reality checking it, does that mean going to somebody who can offer a safe space and be like, can I just run a story past you that I'm telling myself? I'm telling myself a story. Can I just reality check this with you? I think I'm a horrible person because I tell a lot of lies. I think I'm a liar,
Yeah.
And, let's take one, laziness, right? I'm a lazy person. I don't get anything done. I'm unproductive, and I'm never going to amount to anything because I'm lazy. Is that true? Am I lazy? And, it's very easy to see in someone's life. And I'll just, to say, for some things, yeah, you are. Like for some of you, like your schoolwork or your work, yeah, I've seen you lazy. But like when you're with your kids and you run them around all day, it's the furthest thing from lazy. You have so much energy to help them with their homework. You're the complete opposite of lazy, And to help people understand that these are narratives, not absolutes. Is this right? Am I getting it right? Kind of, sort of?
I think you're almost there.
This is why I had you on the podcast. What am I missing? Show me, teach me.
I think you did what a lot of people probably do, is you answer the question, right? You said, yeah, you're lazy here. You're not lazy there. Versus when we go to someone and we're in that really vulnerable moment.
Yeah.
If I am brave enough to be that vulnerable with you, what I need first is empathy and curiosity. So I need you to say, oh, that's a hard feeling. What's making you feel that way?
Got it.
And then I get to say what's making me feel that way.
I went into classic fix-it mode.
That is the problem with that. That's part of the challenge, especially at work, when we are not comfortable with sitting in the discomfort of someone's really shame-inducing feelings. We want to go to fix it because we want to get them out of the discomfort. And honestly, we don't want to be in the discomfort because fixers, and again, recovering fixer, and I would say I'm only maybe 20% recovered. I'm still a really bad fixer. I mean, I'm a good fixer. I think my ideas are amazing. But I'm still working on it because I am uncomfortable with your discomfort.
Right.
I want to fix it because I don't want to see you uncomfortable because that makes me uncomfortable.
Oh, that's such a good, I want to fix it. Right, which is why I think when we go right back to the beginning of men versus women, right?
Yes.
Which is women are more comfortable with uncomfortable emotions.
Maybe I wasn't.
On balance.
Yeah.
Here's one thing I am comfortable saying. I can't say whether women are or aren't, but I can say men generally suck at it.
And
right?
I think
for societal reasons, which is we've been told that you can't be this, you can't be that from a pretty young age. Quit your crying. Why are you crying? Man up. This is what we get.
Yeah.
And so when someone expresses emotion to us that makes us uncomfortable, so we don't have to deal with our emotions, it's easier for me to fix yours. My problem is solved.
Yes.
Don't really care about yours. Or I do care about your problem.
Yeah.
But in so doing, I get a twofer.
I often,
I don't have to deal with mine. I fixed yours. I'm a hero.
That's right. I often tell people it's not a matter of innate ability. It is a matter of societal conditioning.
Yeah.
Like you said, men have been told you can't exhibit those behaviors, and women have been allowed to practice them.
You learned this in Iraq. You learned this in your own leadership journey. We cannot help others. We cannot be there for others until we're there for ourselves.
Yeah.
Until we accept, like when you accepted that I'm not cut out for this, so now I'll worry about my people as opposed to worry about my performance. That was a shift, which is to take yourself on and accept your own failings and opportunities makes you a better leader. And how can I hold space for another if I won't allow someone to hold space for me? And so the reason we call you leader is not because you're in charge. The reason we call you leader is not because you have rank over another. The reason we call you leader, the reason we use the word lead is because you went first. You literally went first. You led the people. Tip of the spear, right? If you want people to be open with their emotions with you, then you have to go first. You have to find the courage to be vulnerable with a friend if you want to be the kind of leader who can hold the space for somebody who is vulnerable, who finds the courage to be vulnerable with you.
Yes.
A good leader isn't the one that has all the answers. The good leader is the one who goes first because they've done it.
Can I share a story with you of what that looked like for me? So this was pre-group command. I'm in an organization and I have a guy on my team who is supposed to be helping me manage the tasks in the office. And every time I sent him an email, the tasks wouldn't get done. I would send him a list of tasks and he might do one or two and the other ones wouldn't get done. And it was causing me a lot of frustration. And so I created this document that he could fill out to give me feedback on what he thinks he did well, what he thinks he doesn't do well. And I sent him the email with the form and I said, fill this out. And when I get back, we'll sit down and talk about it. And he sent me back an email and he said, I don't know if you know this, but anytime you give feedback to civilians, it needs to be on X and X and X form, which was just basically the middle finger in an email, right? And so that sent me high and right. And I was like, oh, game on, buddy. So I went back to the office. I wrote down a 6-page memo for record with 68 pages of documentation. Every single time I had asked him to do something in an email, I highlighted it. And so I sit down with him in our feedback session. I said, this is going to be a one-way conversation. And so I start, and I'm like 2 sentences into the memo I had prepared for him to read. And he blows up and he says, you are the most arrogant, egotistical, know-it-all person I've ever worked for. And he's like just going off. And this goes on for probably 2-3 minutes. And he finishes, and when he finishes, he just takes this like deep breath. And even though I was mad and I was frustrated, I looked at him and I said, listen, this isn't who I want to be. I want us to find a way to work together. But it's not working right now. And I need to know, what do you think we can do to make that happen? And in that moment, he started tearing up. And I said, what's going on for you? And he said, every time you criticize me, every time you tell me I didn't do something, every time you tell me I missed a suspense, what I hear is my dad saying, you're a loser, you're a failure, you're never going to amount to anything. And it completely shifted the relationship between us. It never got great, but it definitely was manageable. And I think that's what I mean by, like, you have to go first. I was so frustrated. Again, 68 pages of documentation. I was armored up and I was ready to go to battle. And in that moment, I had to sit in my own discomfort of us not working, me potentially being a bad leader, me potentially not doing things the right way. I had to sit in that before I could ever get to the place to be who I wanted to be. But then once I could be who I wanted to be and I opened the door to showing my own vulnerability, he reciprocated, right? Like, that's what I mean when you go first.
I get asked this question all the time. Simon, what are the most important characteristics for a leader? You know, there's articles written about it, you know, vision, charisma, you know, the same list of things. And of all the great leaders I've met, Some of them have big Steve Jobs visions and some of them don't.
Yeah.
You know, some of them have this insane charisma and some of them don't. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that they all have is courage. Mm. And it's not just the courage to speak truth to power. Mm-hmm. That's a courage. But it's the courage to lead. It's the courage to go first. It's the courage to say, you know what? I don't want to be this person, or this isn't working, or I have to operate differently versus you need to operate differently, you know? And it takes tremendous courage to do that. Tremendous courage. I would argue more courage than speaking truth to power, you know? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a deep breath.
It's the hardest work we'll ever
Here we
do.
go, you know, it's like, but the courage to be vulnerable with somebody you don't want to be vulnerable in front of, that's the real thing. And the great leaders that I've had the opportunity to meet are the ones who are weirdly open about their shortcomings. Yeah. They're just weirdly open about it, to the point where like you expect them to be these tough, armored, and they're just like, I suck at that. Yeah. Or, nah, man, I'm way too distractible, or I'm way too disorganized to get that done. Or, oh, that's why I've got a team, because, oh my God, I suck at this or I suck at that. Or, you know, they normalize being imperfect in the most beautiful, beautiful way.
100%.
I really appreciate you coming on. It's such a joy to hear from you. I'm so
grateful to be here. It was so nice of you to ask.
Of course.
That was fun.
That's the right answer. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And if you'd like even more optimism, check out my website, simonsinek.com, for classes, videos, and more. Until then, take care of yourself, take care of each other. A Bit of Optimism is a production of The Optimism Company. It's produced and edited by Lindsay Garbenius, David Jah, and Devin Johnson. Our executive producers are Henrietta Conrad and Greg Rudershan.